Thanks everyone for coming. We're having a few technical difficulties this morning, so bear with us as we get through that. This is the Public Safety Coordinating Council meeting for July, and we have a few things that we need to do as far as just some housekeeping stuff, and then we have a presentation about ballot measure 110 from the sheriff, HHS, and Medford Police Department. So before we begin, I think we'll just go around the room and ask everyone to introduce themselves. I'm Kiki Parker Rose. I have the privilege of serving as the Jackson County Community Justice Director.
Beth Hecker, District Attorney.
Dave Sickler, Jackson Sheriff.
Josh Alder, Jail Commander.
And what else?
You're the Vice Chair of this. Thank you, Sheriff.
Wanted to make sure you get your title.
Yeah.
I hear that he's a big deal. I'm DJ Graham, Deputy Chief, Medford Police Department.
I'm Ben Bloom, Jackson County Circuit Court Judge, Presiding Judge. And I have to tell you, everyone, I'm so excited to be here because of scheduling conflicts. We have a presiding judge meeting usually at the same time. Tried to change it with the chief. She's been receptive, but the schedule is set, so next year it'll change. But our meeting got canceled today, so I came here and I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you.
Danny Jordan, County Administrator.
Mike Benson, Station Commander for the State Police.
Stacy Brubaker, Department Director for Jackson County Health and Human Services. And now you make me nervous, Judge, because I am a presenter. I hope I make it worth your time.
It will be always tasty.
Randy Sparacino, Mayor of the City of Medford.
Bobby Devine, Deputy Director of the Transition Center.
Tira Hubbard, Deputy Director of Adult Probation.
Susan Mullen, Jackson County Sexual Assault Response Team.
Joe Ferguson, Deputy Director of Juvenile Services. Mike Parson, Centerpoint City Council, also Centerpoint Police Department, and the Volunteer Coordinator of the Volunteers.
Tanya Phillips, Health Promotion and Preparedness Manager at Jackson County Public Health.
Doug Houston, Program Manager at Jackson County Mental Health.
Okay, and then folks joining us via Zoom, Marcy, will you? Jennifer Novak.
Jennifer Millennium, Director of CASA of Jackson and Justin County.
Dr. Aries.
We're Southern Oregon University.
Nathan Olson.
I'm Nathan Olson with Great Heart Therapy and Counseling.
Rita Sullivan.
Rita Sullivan, I'm a psychologist in Medford.
Mark Johnson.
Barbara Johnson, Executive Director of Community Works.
All right, thank you and welcome. The first order of business is we need to review, we sent out the minutes for review from our June meeting. Hopefully everyone had an opportunity to look at those. I would entertain a motion to approve.
I move to approve.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion about the meetings or changes? All right, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? Okay, motion carries.
Yes, we do.
Okay. Next, we also sent out a revision to our bylaws. The Public Safety Coordinating Council bylaws needed to be changed in a couple of sections. First of all, the first thing that we did was there was an OAR change, Oregon Administrative Rule change, regarding who was required to be a member of the Public Safety Coordinating Council. So we've made that addition. And that addition was adding a representative of a community-based nonprofit organization that provides services to victims of crime. And we filled that position with Barbara Johnson from Community Works. So just wanted to let you know that's a change that we're going to ask folks to vote on the bylaws, but that's who we intend to have fill that slot for us. We also had some cleanup language under section 4 regarding officers. This went through council and they suggested some changes. That was all sent out to all of you. Hopefully you had an opportunity to address any of those or review. And if everyone is all right with the changes that we've suggested, I would entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion on the adjustments to the bylaws?
Do they actually have to go to the commissioners for approval after we?
Yes. So I guess we're making a recommendation for the bylaws to be approved. Thanks, Dan. Okay, any other discussion? All those in favor? Aye.
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 Opposed? All right, motion passes. Next, we have a presentation on ballot measure 110. That'll be done with Stacy Brubaker from Health and Human Services, Sheriff Sickler, and Deputy Chief Graham from the Medford Police Department.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity to talk here today. We worked on this presentation together. Obviously, we're not going to encompass all the impacts, but this is based on a health and human services perspective and more of a criminal justice perspective, with DJ and I leading that conversation. We talk about ballot measure 110. I think we all have been talking about this quite a bit. We just want to present some data and some of the things that we're seeing from our level, and also be cognizant that there are other factors too to the things that we see in our county specifically. So to say measure 110 is responsible for all our woes would be disingenuous, but we do believe it's a significant contributing factor to certain things. And hopefully through our presentation today, that'll be clear. And then just a caveat with data, data tells part of the story, doesn't always tell the whole story. And so numbers are numbers, and, they're important because they give us benchmarks or measurements, but, just because of a number has changed doesn't make it conclusive of the issue. And we'll talk about that, but I just like to give that caveat as we go through it. And sometimes data can change too over time a little bit. So, all right.
All right. Next slide. There we go. So as you know, the philosophy behind Measure 110 was really to try to address drug addiction and overdoses that are a severe problem in Oregon. We actually have some stats we'll get into a little bit later, but Oregon needs to expand access to substance use disorder treatment. Really looking at it from a health-based approach to addiction and overdose is more effective, more humane, and cost-effective than in the criminal justice system. And making people criminals because they suffer from addiction is expensive, ruins lives, and makes access to treatment and recovery more difficult. So those were the premises of ballot measure 110. I'm not the Pollyanna of this group. I'm just laying the context for what we thought we were getting when it was on the ballot, and whether you voted for it or you didn't vote for it. So I wanted to show this next video. If you could make that go. This is what we were told.
Oregon ranks among the most challenged states in the nation for substance abuse, while being among the worst states for access and engagement with care. That's from a 2019 government report detailing the state's shortcomings in dealing with drug abuse. On November 3rd, Oregon voters will decide on a new and controversial approach to dealing with that problem. Should we decriminalize all drugs?
In this unprecedented year, Oregon is attacking the war on drugs a way no other state has, by easing up on the penalties. The United States has a major drug problem, and Oregon is no different. So on November 3rd, Oregon has decided to let its people vote on whether or not things should change. Oregon Measure 110, or the Drug Decriminalization and Addiction Treatment Initiative, aims to reclassify personal drug possession offenses from a Class A misdemeanor to a Class E violation. This means that the penalty for personal possession would go from 1 year in prison and a $6,250 fine to just a max fine of $100 that could be possibly waived if you get treatment. This is only for personal possession, so illegal manufacturing or distribution of illegal drugs would still be a criminal penalty. This measure also aims to increase treatments for drug addiction. Part of the funding would come from Oregon's marijuana tax revenue and also state prison savings in the following years. While this may be unprecedented in the US, it is not in the whole world. In 2001, Portugal decriminalized drugs. They were the first, and so far only, country to do this. In the late 90s, around half of Portugal's prison population was in prison for reasons related to drugs. But since 2001, when Portugal decriminalized drugs, they have seen positive change. The support for this measure is huge. the ballot measure committees reported receiving over $5.7 million in cash and similar contributions. The Drug Policy Alliance was a group that contributed over $4.5 million to the committees. While there are many groups and organizations that are in opposition, there are even more groups in favor of this policy. Some of the arguments in favor of this measure include promoting treatment and rehabilitation for addiction instead of criminalization, and also it is raising more money to help with those treatments. Some believe that this is wrong, though, saying that this could lead to an increase in drug usage because of the less harsh penalties, and that people would actually have to seek out help. It won't just come to them all of a sudden if the measure passes. Although these may be true, if Oregon starts trending the way Portugal did when they decriminalized drugs, this will be worth it in the long run.
And we all know it passed. So I felt like when I rewatched that there were some of the things that it talked about that it was the people on the no side were worried about really has become true. It really has harmed our youth, and being able to try to readdress those issues and try to get ballot measure 110 improved or repealed just really hasn't gone very well. So I have to step closer to this slide because it's so teeny on mine that I can't read it. So this is just an example of where we're at, where we fall within Oregon. So Oregon's total population is 4.25 million. Oregonians with substance use disorder are about 18%, or approximately 774,350. And then Oregons with a substance use disorder and criminal justice involvement of those is 19%. So you can see we certainly have an issue to address, and we certainly have a large population that is also criminal justice involved. But I don't feel like ballot measure 110 has really taken us to where we've needed to go for that population. The other part around that first video is it is true. Treatment doesn't come to you because none of this is treatment dollars. This is all outreach and being able to go to people to try to engage them. There was no investment on the treatment side. So that is true, that there is no treatment. And that's really where the bottleneck has become one of the biggest issues. And for law enforcement too, even if you came across somebody that was ready for services and treatment, they still go into a queue for a long wait list of services.
So Stacy, 18% of the entire population of our state is substance abuse disorder. We gotta be way up there per capita for states to have.
I think we're number one.
Yeah.
Wow.
And one of the lowest on access to treatment.
We're like 49th.
49th out of like 51 if you count that.
So.
Yeah. So yeah, for sure. All right. So the funding, it did get approved. Obviously, this was a total mess at OHA. Oregon Health Authority did not offer the support to the group that was selected to be the reviewer of those applications. So there has been a lot of criticism around that, but the funding formula is really based on the 2020 population census for each county. And then it had some weighted factors in that too. 30% for population of Medicaid recipients, 30% for houseless population, 20% for arrests, and 20% for drug overdose deaths. So we obviously have a higher percentage of many of those things. So using that formula, we actually got a total of $17,407,362.26 for the ballot measure 110 efforts. And it'll be interesting to see what that really gets us in the long run. So the next part is really, these are all the folks who got it. We did have, I believe at this meeting, somebody came and talked about our JCRN, which is what we call the BURN, is the Jackson County Resource Network. And those are all of the people who got dollars. They applied for it on behalf of being able to provide services in Jackson County. And then there was one group that applied outside and actually got more funding for those services than we did at the county. And so that's been kind of an ongoing issue. Oversight of these dollars is a challenge. Accountability is a challenge. And really trying to put some reins around how it's overseen and how it's measured has become a really big talking point and often a big point of frustration, both at the state and local level.
I hate to monopolize the question and answer period because that infuriates me, but not that I monopolize it, but what's on the screen right now. Who sat on this panel that approved the distribution of the funding?
It was by application only. And there was only one person from Jackson County. It's not anybody I'm familiar with. But I did sit in on Representative Nose actually held a group during the legislative session to figure out what they needed to do to kind of fix it. And that was probably one of the biggest sticking points was that OHA didn't offer the support needed to this group of folks. I watched some of those because they were available remotely. And there really was no order, no parameters put around it. Some of the ways that group decided to give the money aren't really ways that you would do if you had had a standard process in place. So there's been a lot of questions around that process as well. And OHA has taken a lot of heat for that. And when we get into further slides, I'll actually talk a little bit about what they have proposed as the fixes and what has actually passed to do that.
I have one question. Is there any kind of spreadsheet that shows where the 17 million was appropriated?
Yeah, OHA has that. It's on their website, and then we certainly can find access and get it sent out if you'd like.
Second question, will this presentation be available to the public?
Yeah.
Could it be?
This presentation is recorded,
Okay.
so that is posted to the website.
Okay, thank you.
This slide's just mostly for perspective. When I talk to the public about this, they're shocked to find out that rolling through a stop sign is a $265 fine. If you're not wearing your seatbelt, you get a $115 fine. If you're shooting up with fentanyl in Hawthorne Park, it's a $100 fine. So it's some perspective about the penalties associated with this. And that's really what this is about.
Okay, and there's no penalty if you don't pay your $100 fine. That's the other caveat. There's no, like, you don't go to collections, you don't get your license suspended or anything like that. It's just, well, okay. It'll just be adjudicated as not paid. So we talk about suicides and overdoses in our county. Obviously, 2021 and 2022, we saw pretty significant increases from previous years. And as you know, Measure 110 went into effect in February of 2021. And this year, unfortunately, we're seeing a real spike in overdoses already. So this year alone, we have like 73 or 74 potential cases that are overdoses. And I say potential because we're waiting for 40 toxicology reports to come back from the State Police Crime Lab before we can actually determine if it's an overdose or not. But based on scene investigations and, statements and things of that nature, our MEs make a determination on seeing that's likely an overdose. And that's what you saw in the news this last week.
Sure.
Yeah.
What's the data that data is through?
That's as of yesterday or day before. So through this month.
Roughly 50% of the year, and we're already
at like 73 or 74, yeah.
Nate, this is a way off base question, but my wife works in ICU at Asante. She talks every day about people who are coming in, recovering from overdosing on fentanyl. They're still alive, but they're being hospitalized. I'm just wanting to push for this was it's going to be less costly taking it out of the criminal justice system, but now they're in ICU at the hospital. And I'm just wondering if we track data for hospitalizations or we have access to that.
Yeah, we do.
Okay. For hospitalizations too?
I have it for emergency department data. So, and then Mercy Flights provides us information when they've made a response, an intervention, and a transport is made. And that's what I base all of our overdose alerts on is the mortality, ED admissions, and then EMS and law enforcement.
Because I would guess hospital admissions went up
They've
more
gone up a lot since
than
really
this has gone up.
Yeah, we started to really see an increase. It was about February of 2021, so about a month after Measure 110. All those data points, so really that 911 response system as a whole just spiked. And it's stayed.
Yeah, no hospital bed is way more expensive than a jail bed.
Oh, by far. And we have some data to those, but maybe not exact hospital data, but we have some other data that the city of Medford has provided. And they're really the kind of the lion's share because of their geographical location. So you heard about the news. We recently, or you saw this in the news, we had 10 overdose deaths in 5 days. Again, likely overdose deaths. I got to caveat that is that we don't have toxicology reports. But you can see the second one there is they're awaiting toxicology. The other ones are all fentanyl suspected. And so fentanyl is playing a huge role in our overdoses for sure. It's a pretty potent and dangerous drug. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, just I reached out to Asante to try to get that data, and they couldn't compile it for me in time to present it here. But they definitely talked to us a lot about stuff getting pushed into ERs instead of engaging the criminal justice system. So, yeah, I watched the video that Stacy played, and it said it'll be worth it in the long run. We look at that last slide, and I wonder, do we have to lose a whole generation of people before it's worth it? I mean, how many people are going to die because of overdoses before the state realizes that we're allowing these people to kill themselves without trying to intervene at all? So if we look at this slide right here, it's opiate overdoses and the responses by law enforcement. So this slide goes back to 2019. We saw fentanyl enter our market in 2018 that we can confirm. We saw our first large drug seizures involving fentanyl in 2019. So if we go to that 2021 bar, that's when you see Measure 110 come into effect in February of that year. And you see a drastic increase in our overdose responses right after that. And you look over to 2023, we're at 306, and those numbers are through mid-July. So we could easily be over 600 by the end of the year.
Question.
Yes, sir.
So the legislative body addressed this in the last legislative session, didn't they? They increased the penalties for fentanyl, but we're actually not seeing that materialize on the street.
No. In fact, when I talked to the supervisor for the livability team who engages in these type of issues every day, he thinks we can solve our issues in the Greenway and downtown with probation connected misdemeanors, even if they gave us that back. But we're having a hard time getting people to engage in services, and we'll get into that more as the presentation goes along. So this is fatal opiate overdoses. Again, that 2018 is when we saw fentanyl enter the market. We see a decrease in overdoses over the next 2 years. Measure 110 comes into effect in 2021. We see a dramatic increase in those numbers. And we look over to 2023, we could be well over 100 by the end of the year. This is just some historical data on drug prices. How much is it in response to Measure 110 and how much is in response to fentanyl entering the market? We won't know. A lot of this, we have so little data since 2001. It's going to be potentially a generation of people before we really know the impacts of Measure 110 if it continues on the way it is. But if we look back to 2018, fentanyl was $80, heroin was $131. As fentanyl increases through 19 and 20, we don't have, I wasn't able to find some really good solid data on drug prices for 21 and 22, but I was for 23. And we look at phenols, the price of phenols dropped from 140 in 20 to 80 in 23, and the heroin prices. Cocaine's been fairly stable, and methamphetamine prices have been fairly stable.
And talking to our patrol staff and detectives, they say the market, according to people they interact with on the street, users of these substances, the market's flooded. It's much easier to get their hands on drugs at this time because of the lax penalties and the no accountability.
Can I say one more thing on that? Prior to Measure 110, you didn't find anything but residue downtown on the Greenway when you're dealing with the homeless population. Now we're finding grams and grams of drugs in tents and in camps. The increase in the quantity of drugs is tremendous.
Well, I mean, not to intervene in your presentation, but we have like 100 facilities at the county. We also manage the library facilities, the maintenance for the library facilities. We found fentanyl just sitting out on the bathroom shelves. We found needles, like hundreds of them stuck down the drain where people were injecting with fentanyl. So it's not just on the Greenway, it's in our public buildings. I mean, it's everywhere these people can go that are public places.
Yeah, and then they take that needle that they got from the stabbing wagon and they shove it down your drain at the library.
Okay, so we just want to present some numbers, historical numbers. So these are crimes against persons. So these are going to be your assaults and things of that nature. You can see we declined a little bit, and then starting in 2021, post-pandemic, it started to pick up again. And last year we had a pretty significant increase. Crimes against society, these are going to be your disorderly conducts, trespasses against real property, littering, things of that nature. Slight decline for us. Again, I think Medford hosts the majority of the livability issues because of the central location in the county. This is good news. So in 2021, both the Sheriff's Office and MPD had a record number of homicides. So being much lower in that number is a good thing. So we're happy with that. And Medford had a reduced number too, but DJ will get into that information. Okay, this is no surprise. Drug offenses way down. Obviously, with there not being a crime to possess certain amounts of drugs, we don't have necessarily the time as a sheriff's office to issue e-violations. Our guys will do it occasionally, but it's not a priority for them to go through that work, and especially when you see the results of the e-citations, which I think will be fairly alarming as to the effectiveness of their intended, what they were intended to do.
Are most of those drug crimes delivery or manufacturing?
Yeah, or they possess over the amounts.
Personal use.
Personal use, yeah. So if they're over the 3 grams, it's 3 grams for heroin or 2, I don't remember. Somewhere in there, and then it was 5 grams for fentanyl. So that was one thing that did change in this legislation. So you could have 5 grams of fentanyl and still qualify for that e-violation up until this legislative session. DUI is pretty consistent. I know that anecdotally, our staff talk about the presence of paraphernalia and other things in cars now that wasn't the same before, which obviously leads to DUIs. The thing with DUIs is it's a number that can fluctuate based on availability of staffing because it's generally a proactive initiated crime, meaning gals are driving around, they see something, they make a traffic stop and find a DUI. But if they're busy responding to calls, they necessarily can't do that proactive work. So, but anecdotally, our staff feel like there's more para drivers out there. Property crime is up from last year, and I'll caveat property crime. We went through a change with our reporting. We went from OUCR to NIBRS a couple years ago, and I truly believe that changed our property crime number. Now, and only because we used to be able to catch certain things through our CAD system. So if a deputy went to a call and somebody said, "Hey, someone stole my bike and my cooler off my porch," and it was only valued at $100, that might generate a criminal report that a deputy writes. They'll enter the information into CAD, which says, "Hey, there's no suspects, there's minimal value, nothing to really follow up on, there's no serial numbers," so they don't write a criminal report. That data used to be captured through our CAD system, and now it's not. They have to write reports, and so that's why I think the numbers are low. I also believe that there's some underreporting countywide for property crime just because it's so prevalent. For instance, I was talking to the employees at Blue Dog Trailers. Now it's changed names or something, but it's on Coker Butte. And they said they were victimized nearly daily in some sort, whether it was a battery theft or propane tanks or other mischief to their trailers because they don't have it, fenced off like AAA RV or now it's Camping World off Biddle Road and Ford, where they put up the big fences with the electric deterrents. But he said we didn't even call anymore because it happens so much. It's like, what can you do about it, honestly? So I do believe there's an underreporting countywide in our property crime. And I do believe people think we're busy and have other things to do and don't want to bother us with some of this stuff. Okay.
So I brought some quotes from patrol officers, both the livability team and me, and some of the drug officers, because I sit behind a desk most of the time. Most of my work's on a computer and meetings and on the phone. So I do want to share some of these as we go through this. Measure 110 does nothing to address a person's addiction. It merely removes an accountability for the behavior. A lack of accountability for a behavior will reduce the incentive to get help for their addiction. Measure 110 has made our jobs exponentially more difficult. If sobriety and clean lifestyle is a desired result of Measure 110, it is an abject failure. So let's go to the next slide here. Oh, I have the clicker.
Other way.
Oh, there we go. So this is some data just from this last year from the school district, 549C. They didn't keep this type of data prior to this last school year, so I can't compare it to the past. But last year they had 71 drug-related incidents in the school. They found fentanyl on 2 different school properties this year, and they had 2 overdoses related to students. 1 resulted in death. So they recognize that there was an impact of Measure 110 on school. They just don't have the data to show it. So they are tracking now. Narcan deployments. So again, as we look at this, we remember 2018, we start to see fentanyl entering in the county. We have Measure 110 marked in green at the bottom where it comes into in 2021. We have 75. I'm going blind. 76, then it goes to 81 in 2020, and we're already in the 60s this year. So this is related directly to our fire department, and this slide is mistitled. It should be medical responses, not overdose and poisoning. So our fire department, just the kind of impacts that they're seeing on them. So with the implementation of Measure 110, their call volume goes from 6,200 to 8,200. With overdose calls, there was a 30% jump in overdose calls between those 2 years. And then they go into 2022, and then they saw a 60% jump from 2020 in overdose calls. So the impact, it's beyond just our department. It's impacting everybody. And this is just the impact on our local fire department in terms of medical related calls. Overdose deaths. So we see fentanyl enter the market. We see a spike up to 20. It starts to decline. And then with the implementation of Measure 110, we see it jump dramatically.
And these are just for the city.
This is just for the city of Medford. This is not countywide. These slides are just the city of Medford. So we look at 2023 where it's 36 already. This slide was put together before that news article that the sheriff presented with the 10 in 1 week. So those numbers are even higher today. So we have a team. We have the livability team. They the majority of their time is dealing with the homeless population. So in 2019, their calls for service were 77. In 2020, 1750. And then we see the implementation of Measure 110, and the whole nature of that team changes. Their numbers go up dramatically. They continue to increase, and they're dealing with fentanyl and fentanyl addicted individuals constantly now. They're finding drugs on the greenway, in the tents. They're finding people with needles in their arms. It's what they're dealing with day in and day out. So I wanted to talk a little bit. We talked about the livability team, but everybody may not know that the city of Medford purchases jail beds it's basically for our municipal court. But the majority of the time that those beds are filled with people engaged, that the livability team's engaged with, chronic offenders, people that the municipal court needs to see. Well, we've had 61 people placed in those beds since we purchased them. As we engage with those people, we immediately try to get them connected with services, try to start talking to them about engaging with services. And we've seen 30% of those people, of that 61 who are willing to engage. Our biggest roadblock is when their services are cut off when they enter the jail system. We have these people who are willing to engage, but that period between the time they leave incarceration and they actually get services again where the service providers can start providing that service, that's where we lose most of them. And even with that, we have 17% of those people who enter a plan post-jail. And a lot of that is helped through grants from the service providers who receive grants, who are able to get in there and actually engage during that time. But if you compare that to those cases, there's 529 people who have been charged with an e-violation. 48 of those have actually gotten assessment. It's 0.8%. So we have a far greater success rate, even though our numbers are considerably different. But we have a greater success rate with our municipal jail program. It just demonstrates that if there was a jail and we could get people connected with services, get them sober enough to talk to a service provider, we could see a far greater impact than Measure 110.
Do you know if this is a trend across the state?
I don't.
Because I'm just wondering, I mean, basically you're creating a probation system within your city, which is ridiculous because community corrections is probably the bargain of the criminal. It's the cheapest way to deal with people. If you can get them in the system, you're kind of creating your own little system there. You're getting, I would say even lower outcomes than community corrections gets. I mean, they probably have an 80% success rate for people who are on probation they used to go through treatment and those types of things. So it's kind of amazing to me that, Measure 110 is forcing all these now cities to get involved, in something that was centralized across the state in a program that was very successful moving people through before Measure 110.
Yeah, and the other thing with that too is Senate Bill 48 has driven this partnership with MPD a little bit because some of the lower level charges that these individuals do on a daily basis that impact our livability, we can't hold in jail by law now. And muni charges are not subjected to Senate Bill 48 requirements. So they have the ability to hold their muni court differently than if we went through state court, we would have to kick them out. So that's another reason. And I think why this has been successful with those lower level offenders.
When I talk to law enforcement around the state, when I go to conferences or meetings and stuff, most of the rest of the state most of the northern part of the state doesn't believe that you can enforce homelessness, the laws surrounding homelessness. They don't do it. We're isolated from the rest of the state, and so we have to be creative in a lot of ways. We don't have the same kind of supports, and we have to be creative and come up with ideas and work through these processes. And we're having some success that the rest of the state isn't having regionally. Yes, sir.
To that point, I presented on our livability team at the Oregon Mayor's Conference last August. Everybody was excited about doing this, and I handed out probably 50 cards. No one called me. They are all excited to see it, and once they get back to their cities,
you are doing a great job, but it's really a cost shift. I mean, the state used to fund corrections. Now you're funding livability teams to create whole systems. I mean, I know you're renting beds from the county, but we're also subsidizing those beds heavily so that you can have this tool. It's costing everybody way more than the previous system did with, obviously, your point, way less better outcomes.
Wait a second, that's not what the video said.
Yeah.
Which is why we played it.
So I went through the processing for those that 30% that engaged with services. There was only one issue that every single one of them was dealing with, and it was always drug addiction. Everything else was pretty diverse in how they ended up in their position in homelessness. But the one thing that was common between every individual was drug addiction. So we do inside our department, we have somebody who deals with chronic offenders, people who are repeatedly engaging. Usually it's a muni theft, like shoplifting, people that are just doing it over and over and over again. So I asked the individual that deals mostly with that, how many people he has listed as a chronic offender. It's been 163 since he started tracking in 2021. Most of his work is behind a desk and behind a phone, so he's not out there engaging these people all the time. But his conservative estimate was 80% of those people are dealing with addiction issues. those are also people that engage in those mini beds. Downtown district. Downtown is a big deal in the city of Medford right now. Since Measure 110, our downtown business owners have been screaming for help. They haven't understood the issue. They didn't know what the change was. Well, we see our calls for service in the downtown area haven't changed all that much, but the type of calls have. So if we look at the disorderly conducts, we'll see that we've got a significant increase after Measure 110. And these are the type, we changed in our downtown area from being bar-related calls for service, stuff like that, thefts. Thefts continue to be a problem, but the bar-related problems aren't nearly as prevalent. But we are seeing disorderly conducts, trespass, harassment, that type of behavior that we're having to engage with in the downtown area. Greenway calls for service, and these are strictly dispatched calls. They're not self-initiated calls by our livability team. So we see in 2017, we're around 1,000. We see it jump up dramatically after Measure 110. Keep in mind that COVID happened during this period of time. Our livability team and the work they are doing was put on a hold. So part of that may be related to that. But we see that in 2022, it dropped a little bit. But the city of Medford has also poured a huge amount of resources into the Greenway at the same time. And we know that the management-directed patrols can impact calls for services, and I believe that that's what you're seeing there. We've dumped a huge amount of resources. We've committed people to that area, and so you see a decline in services. And it's what Mr. Jordan referred to. We're spending a lot of money here with personnel, and so we're impacting that number. But if we took those people out, we would see that number increase. Measure 110 violations. And so, and these are just our numbers as a city, how many e-tickets we're writing. Our chief truly believes that at some point the state's going to try to blame law enforcement for the failure of Measure 110 because they're not engaging in the process. So our chief wants us to go out there and engage this, and that's why we're doing it. So you'll see that our citations will probably be over 500 this next year. Currently in the Jackson County is the third highest in the state. Josephine County and Multnomah County had higher numbers last year. We were third in that, but I suspect that we'll flip one of those places based on some of these numbers this year.
EJ, Chief Ivins is correct. I went up and visited with many different legislators last May, and Measure 110 was one of our issues because we were trying to deal with the addiction problem that's really driving our homeless situation. And probably 50% of the people that we talked to, which were supporters of Measure 110 initially, tried to insinuate that law enforcement's lack of e-citations is the problem why we're not seeing success.
Yeah. But I'm sure they completely ignore the number that only 49 of the 5,300 people that have received a citation have engaged in services. Crimes against persons. So we saw a spike in 2021. We saw it drop down to more of that area where it had been stable prior to that. Did you want to say something?
I was just going to say, for the effectiveness, there's, as of June 31st, I was looking for my phone to get the exact number. I don't know if I left it up here. There were 5,300 e-citations issued in Oregon, 5,300 across the state. 43 people have a verified assessment through that program. 43 out of 5,300. So they're blaming law enforcement, but the program is wildly ineffective at delivering what their intention is. So that's that very small number of 0.8 or whatever it is percent. It's pretty abysmal. So it's not effective. And you could issue 10,000 and I don't see your number changing. I don't see how it's automatically going to increase the number of assessments.
It's a statistically sound sample size thus far.
Yeah, 50 since the inception, and like 3,800 just failed to appear or were adjudicated because they didn't appear or didn't make any calls or pay their fines or something like that. And I was looking for the exact numbers because I have them. I'll find them before the end of today.
I think it's in the slide with the red highlighted. So we move into our homicides. So these are our numbers. So far in 2023, we've had one. So we've seen a dramatic decline. Very appreciative of that. So our crimes against property. The sheriff is right. These are being underreported. I know this because I talk to people all the time, especially in the downtown district, because I deal a lot with the Downtown Medford Association, the issues in downtown. They simply don't call because they know we're busy. They know we have other things we're doing. They don't think it's worth the time and the effort. And so we are working really hard with that group to get them to start engaging with their police in this process again. Crimes against society. So you see a major decrease. A lot of that is going to be for the same reasons. They're seeing this person disorder themselves every day. They're having the same behavior repeated. They've called multiple times. If we arrest somebody for menacing, they go to jail, they're out, they're back to the same place again, doing it over again. So they get tired of calling. They're frustrated. Drug offenses, you see a dramatic decline. This is a individual officer driven statistics. People don't call in drug offenses nearly as much as an officer gets out and engages and finds drugs. So this is almost all self-initiated work. And they know that there's no recourse to these tickets. So they do write them. We as a city are writing them, but the incentive there to see people to make a difference isn't really there for the officers anymore. So, and we have a huge environmental and livability impact on our city. And I just want to mention on this, that last part of that slide mentions trash. Our livability team and the parks employee that work directly with them have removed 2,500 cubic yards of garbage from the Greenway since May of 21 when they started doing this. There's a huge impact in terms of trash. They're picking up needles every day, and not just a couple. They're everywhere. Our businesses in the downtown Medford are wondering how they're going to survive this. People don't want to come into their businesses because people are scared. Their employees are scared to walk to their cars. It's had a huge impact on our downtown. People constantly calling about the Greenway, wanting to know when they're going to have a park back, when their kids aren't going to be on the playground with a guy with a needle in his arm passed out because he just shot up. There's a huge livability impact on the city as a result of this. Did you have more you want to say on that?
I think it goes into county too, but talking to some of our staff, one of our sergeants, and I have some stuff here, I'll share a little bit about that, but they were talking about that his wife now carries Narcan personally because she's afraid the kids are going to pick stuff up. Right. So there's that. My mom worked in the downtown business district, and she said every day they had to go clean feces or urine out of the stoops of where their business was located. And they don't call. I've had people call me and say people camped on their roofs and want extra patrol to see if we could get them off their roofs because they destroy stuff. And these are things that don't get reported on a daily basis because what do? How does that work? Or, are you going to bother the police? But it really does impact our livability for our community. And everyone's trying on the law enforcement side. This isn't to say that we're not doing stuff. It's just, it's a big problem with not enough resources all the way around to deal with it. To talk about, I think I'll go to the video. I think that's next, isn't it?
I'm not sure. I have one more slide.
Oh, yeah.
Graham,
Yes.
Sheriff Sickles, what's the morale of the officers? Is it slow?
No.
I get the feeling that
I don't think so.
I don't think it's low.
No, I can't speak for the Medford PD, but we work together pretty closely. And our guys, like for instance, said, it's different now because you make traffic stops, and we kind of talked about this. They said it's interesting to try to get motivated to go out and find certain things because, for instance, with Measure 110, someone could have, say, quantity amounts in their car. And tools we used to be able to use to detect that, say a drug dog, right, has changed because they'll leave paraphernalia out in plain view for them to say, hey, this is my user amount and deny consent for whatever else or whatever. And where we could use a dog in the past to maybe get into the car to find those amounts, that's not necessarily possible. as it was before. So a lot of that proactive police work in finding drug cases or quantities of drugs has become much more difficult since 110 has passed, right? Because it is not a crime to possess certain things. So those things, they talk about their challenges, and DJ read a quote from one of his officers, and my officers and deputies are saying the similar things. But they're not, like, we talk about your job is to do your job, and you can't get impacted by all the things around it. Is it frustrating? Yes. Is it, I think, tiring for them to see the same things and see the changes to the community, just like for other community members? Yes. But I don't think they're dissuaded or dislike their jobs because of it.
It's had to have a huge impact on long-term deep drug investigations because you can't cultivate an informant anymore. You used to be able to contact somebody with user amounts and say, hey, where'd you get this from? It doesn't matter anymore. So how has this impacted Madge in doing these huge cases, or is it pretty much all you're doing now is cartel informant cases when you just so happen to come across a large scale amount of drugs?
You know, we're less than 2 years out from Measure 110 being implemented. I think we'll see that more in the future. We are currently working big cases. We're currently doing cartel cases, but I think as we move into the future, we'll see more and more of what kind of impact that has. It certainly has impacted the street level search warrants that are being written through patrol officers using informants. It has impacted that.
One other comment question. I think it's something I find sad. I'm a third generation guy from this valley. The idea that we're giving up on calling the police because we're not going to be with it, that makes me sad. So as a citizen member, run a relatively large company for this valley, we never not call. We'll call, I call.
Yeah.
If we fight, we'll never give up. The day I give up is the day to bury me out there. I will not stop. I feel like when you give up is when we let them win. We're not going to win. It does feel discouraging when you deal with the same people and the same problem over and over. Agreed. You can't stop. And when you give up, it's just not who we are. We can't give up.
We encourage people. So when I'll do a public presentation, we'll talk about the property crime stuff, and we say, we'd rather have the information than not. Like, yeah, we might not solve it, but we can direct resources based on where things are happening. So we can use hotspot models or other types of programs. If we know an area is being targeted for, like, say, car clouds, breaking into cars, or other property type crimes, and we see patterns, we can assign detectives or patrol people to work on that. But if we don't know about it, it makes it harder for us. So we always encourage to report. And we have online reporting systems, so people don't have to feel like they have to bother a deputy or an officer and have them come out to their house. They can file an online report if they feel like this is a minor thing, like it's a cooler got stolen in my yard. We still want to know about it because it helps us advocate for resources or different policies if we know about what's going on in its entirety.
Yeah, on that, when I deal with the downtown businesses, they'll say, well, this problem's been going on for a year and a half. I'll pull up the calls for service. There's no reports. So we are data driven. I mean, you look up here, every one of our slides has a number attached to it. If you aren't calling us, we as an agency don't really know what's happening. So we have to have that engagement. So, and then I send out an email to the entire police department asking them their opinions on Measure 110. And this was the first response I got. First person that was out doing bike patrol in the downtown area sent me the welcome to Medford with the 2 pictures. And then the next 4 emails were the statements. So, I've seen a dramatic change about how homelessness people relate to drug use. Community members regularly come across addicts openly using in parks and on the Greenway. So
Thursday morning, getting fuel. That's my friends. Welcome back for come back soon.
Yeah. So I mean, this is what we as an agency, our officers are seeing every day when they go out there along the Greenway downtown. The bottom picture, that's the 9th Street Bridge. It's right in the middle of the 9th Street Bridge. Or if you go out there and you look at the bridge, not that anybody uses it anymore, it's named Fetty Bridge for fentanyl. So
I think we've captured some video. This is last week. that we took this and we just wanted to kind of show people what we're talking about, because sometimes we get up here as law enforcement and say, oh, woe is us, or, we're doomsdayers, or we're talking about the problem. But this actually kind of gives you perspective of what it looks like. And this is despite the efforts that the livability team and our staff do. This is post kind of cleanup. This is post enforcement. Go ahead and play it if you can.
For you to sing for us?
No, I turned the music off. I wasn't a big fan of it, but we can narrate over the top.
Did it play the chess music?
No, it's a little more nefarious. It's hard to put music to this stuff without it getting, you're not taking that seriously enough, or you're overemphasizing it enough, too much. You can see the Sharpies containers and the piles of needles. And this is what our MEs talk about when they go down to these death scenes where someone's overdosed, is just the huge amount of needles and drug paraphernalia out on the pass. There's a rig. Lots of, I think, harm reduction stuff. And one of our MEs, made a good point about like harm reduction and some of the efforts, especially with one of our local providers, is, where's the harm being reduced from? Because the community is certainly experiencing a negative effect from some of these policies. And they deal with it because they're dealing with all the overdoses on top of this other stuff. And so it's just an interesting perspective from somebody that has to work in that environment every day and see this stuff. Not seeing a lot of reduction in harm for users or the community.
For the harms reduction folks, for example, the staff and Wagner, required to try to get referrals to treatment programs when they reach out to stuff like that?
Not that I'm aware of.
It's the intention of the dollars.
But there's no contract requirement on it.
Is that the particular needle program? There used to be able to exchange, like gave you 12 needles, you gave me 12.
So I brought Tanya to be able to answer these
I wonder,
questions.
when you see the volume, they're not exchanging.
So what was your question, sorry?
Is that particular place that's stabbed in the wagon or whatever, is it also an exchange supposedly?
From what I've heard, they don't do an exchange, so there isn't that model. I have heard that they'll give sharps containers, but they don't take in anything.
It just seems to me like a bottle program. If you're going to get a clean needle, you should turn 3 dirty ones in. That would solve half of the
They
problem.
would be out picking them up to get their numbers
Exactly.
up.
Not waiting people that don't partake in that certain trade, touching all of that stuff.
Well, there's a difference between a harm reduction program and a true syringe exchange program. Tanya runs a true syringe exchange program. The others offer what is being referred to as harm reduction, and it really does take away from the effort of those that really try to follow best practice and do the things to mitigate risk and promote recovery.
So I feel like that's part of the hard conversation is when you look at the science of harm reduction, when you're talking about syringes, there's different models. We have what we call like a 1-for-1 exchange, but we're not a strict 1-for-1 exchange in the sense of our goal is we want to ensure that we're doing our best to prevent the spread of HIV and Hep C and other bloodborne infections. So if someone does come to us and they don't have anything, we do give them a supply, but we also track all of our data. So for our program, looking back from 2016, when we started to the capacity that we're at, for every 0.98 syringe that is brought in, one goes out. So we're pretty close to a 1-for-1 exchange. Even looking the past January to March, we took in more than what we gave out. And so, you know, that is part of our program. We do provide that education. So like when we get reports of certain businesses, or just complaints about just syringes out in the community, like we educate our clients and let them know where those sites are. So if they're in the neck of the woods and you have a sharps container, could you like help out a little bit? Is every person that accesses our services, do they do that? No, but I mean, we definitely, for us, I think as the county operating these kinds of services, I feel like we have more of a responsibility, like when public health is doing this, we still have to look at the community as a whole. So we do have to look at how we're protecting the public, the parks and so forth. Like we don't operate out of the parks. Before we started our syringe exchange program, like we met with law enforcement, we met with the judges, the hospitals, all of those partners, just to make sure that like they knew what we were doing, how our program works. You know, law enforcement for us, like they are a partner for us. That's very important. Because at the end of the day, like we would rather people come to us so that we can, one, help reduce some of the litter, but we also then are able to provide education, referrals, connection to care for us is huge. At the end of the day, my goal is that we would rather have people in MAT, so medication assisted treatment, drug treatment. I had called NPD before when the golden ticket was out there, and after syringe exchange sat there for an hour so this person could get an assessment done. So for us, I think our model is probably a lot different than some of the others that have been mentioned, but for us, I mean, I feel like we have more of a responsibility as a county.
But your model is not primarily just harms reduction. So if the addicted individual were to recover and we had no more addiction, he would still exist. Whereas if you're just primarily a harms reduction entity, such as those that we've talked about, if there was no addiction, they would no longer exist.
I would love it if syringe exchange didn't exist. I'd be very happy with that. But yes, so I mean, and I've had clients tell us like, you're so much different. It seems like they want us to use drugs. You want us to help us. And those have come from clients that have been very, very deep in the addiction. And when we saw that transition from black tar heroin being the main illicit opioid transition to like fentanyl.
I have a question in the chat. How is officer exposure to fentanyl?
Well, they're trained and they have PPE to use that. They have locations that are set up for them to be able to process that stuff if they come across it and want to collect it as evidence. And then, of course, they all carry Narcan personally and in their cars. So
it's the same for us.
Same for MPD for the question. And then a couple anecdotal things. So I talked to our sergeants as well, our shift sergeants, and a couple things that were interesting to me. Sergeant said he and another deputy would interview people who were addicted they would make contact with, especially along the Greenway, or appeared to be in the same situation as we just viewed these folks on the video. And they tell them, frankly, that there's no reason not to do drugs since Measure 110. There's no motivation or there's no accountability, so why not? They've become accustomed to the rules, and they would use government subsidized funds to go buy small amounts of drugs at a time instead of a large amount, and because they knew they wouldn't get in trouble. And they're not as afraid of having paraphernalia or doing these things. And they also just know that tickets will be dismissed if they're issued anyway. So no accountability. One of our sergeants said that Street level, we're seeing a really fearless drug addict who's not ashamed to have or possess hard drugs, specifically fentanyl. There seems to be a casualness to possessing small amounts of fetty and no regard for the effects. I think Measure 110 has made it more acceptable in the community to use drugs like fentanyl. A couple of weeks ago, we responded to a white city for an overdose. He delivered Narcan personally. The guy was about 20, he says. He was completely lifeless and had some agonal breathing, but didn't look good. A few minutes later, he was up and alert with Mercy and on the gurney. Later that night, the shift went back out after he overdosed again. So, unfortunately, he feels like this kid is bound to have his life taken if it already hasn't, because this was given to me about a week ago. He says, quote, "I have yet to see a drug abuser who wants to go out and get the assistance they need based on what Measure 110 was intended to do." Another one, speaking with one of our deputies who probably encounters the most drugs cases on his team, says a lot of people that he has arrested, he's asked what effect Measure 110 has had on them. He said almost every arrestee has told him has made getting drugs easier and getting away with having drugs. He said none of them have gone to any treatment, nor do they plan to based off a citation. He said that he's been told that the change in law did not help them fight addiction, but rather did the opposite. In his experience, he has seen proactivity gone down as far as stopping and arresting people with drugs that are out committing other crimes, because that was often, when I was working patrol, you would find somebody engaged in suspicious behavior. You think they might be casing a neighborhood or out looking for a car to steal or doing whatever. You find drugs, you take them to jail. You can't prove they were going to steal a car, but the drugs gave you an avenue to interrupt that criminal behavior. That doesn't happen anymore with small amounts. Paraphernalia is seen regularly in cars, and defendants don't seem to care or worry about it. Talks about the anecdotal increase in property crime and eludes. And he also was a MADGE detective for 10 years, roughly 10 years. And he still has contacts from people who have reformed. And he says they can't believe there's no consequence for possession, and said the only reason they ever got help was because it was mandated by the courts with the threat of arrest or jail time. So, interesting. Just want to talk about lodgings. Our lodgings are quite a bit. They were down. Obviously, Measure 110 without arresting small amount of drug offenders has changed that in 2021. Also post-pandemic. The Measure 11 is a concerning number though for us, and I'll go through the stats. But 309 Measure 11, and those are our serious offenses, meaning if somebody is convicted of that crime, they're almost always going to go to prison. But I guess there's some caveats to that. But generally speaking, that's what it means. We have a pretty significant amount of forced releases. Lodgings for last year up about 1,200, and then Measure 11's again up 363. Now, in 2019, our Measure 11s were about 155, just to give you an idea. Of course, the pandemic changed things, and then, of course, post Measure 110. Since Measure 110 went into effect, we've had about 33 overdoses in the jail. None have resulted in death, but would have, but for medical intervention. And I said none, and that was a number that no one could remember. And I think that's accurate. Is that right?
No, the one that it was not.
It wasn't an overdose, though. That's right. It was a medical complication from drug use, chronic drug use, and some other medical things, but it wasn't an overdose. But 33 deaths. And prior to 2021, the lieutenant couldn't remember of any. We did change our jail management record system where it's easy to track post 2021, but he's worked there for years beyond that. And he's like, we've had people use drugs in jail, but we don't remember where people have actually coded and had to use different.
Looking at the overdose data for emergency departments, I started to collect it a little bit differently. So you don't see heroin anymore. It's all powdered fentanyl, the blue pills, so your counterfeit pills. But it was so much that I kept seeing the jail called out or for medical clearance. So I actually started to create notes just because Asante had told the media as well, and I wanted to make sure Josh knew that as well. So I just started to look at things. I had to start looking at the data that we had a lot differently, and that even included how people were using the substance, because for our syringe exchange program, at the height of COVID, we saw 60 people in 1 hour, which was like, or not 1 hour, I'm lying, in our 2 hour span. And we would average about 30 to 40 people per shift. And now we're averaging about 10. And so we now start to see a lot less people, which means we're not taking in as much. We're not able to do those referrals, the education. And so I started to even look at the data differently because like, why is this happening? And started to see that people were more likely to like smoke fentanyl, which then if you look at harm reduction, that is typically one that we would encourage people to do because it decreases the risk of HIV and Hep C and typically an overdose, but that's not what was happening with fentanyl. So it's trying to then educate people as well. So, and that's my full story of the jail. It's changed a lot even for how we look at the data.
Yeah. And certainly fentanyl is a much tougher, and Josh could talk about the process, but I get asked sometimes in community meetings, how is it that people get drugs in jail and then overdose? It's like, well, think about really unpleasant things and you'll figure that out for yourself. But basically it's secreting them in their body cavities, and it's very tough to detect because you don't need a lot of fentanyl to have a lot of people get affected by it, as we know. And even though we do a body scanner and a strip search, it's almost impossible to detect at our level. So unless people are really honest, it's going to get in there, and they do it through other means as well. But that's probably the most common in male.
Pre-fentanyl, we saw a lot of people bring drugs from jail if they knew they were coming. So they would turn themselves into parole probation, or they suspect when they went to court they had a warrant, they would get them to jail. Anymore, it just seems like we have lots of people in the community who are walking around with things secreted just in case. In large part, it's the fear of the detox. But typically, when we actually locate the drugs in the facility, it's because the other adults in custody are so scared about the potential for overdose around them that they will eventually finger the person who has been bringing them in. So it's hard to find otherwise.
Bookings historically, just for your reference. Forced releases going back up again as our population increases. We're going to see more forced releases, and we like to blame Measure 110 for a lot of things. But we have a recipe of things in our county that make it more difficult, including jail space, Measure 110. We have Senate Bill 48, and some other things that are just not easy to work around. Here's the one we talked about, Measure 11's significantly higher. In 2019, like I said, we had 153. And we were on a decline of violent crime, and things were improving. And since, again, it's shot back up dramatically. And talking to our detectives, they in most of our homicide cases, there's a nexus to drugs, whether under the influence or some other thing. And that was, they work on MADU, which is a joint task force. And so I asked him about all the cases, and he said almost all of them have some nexus. Now, occasionally you'll have one that doesn't, but most of them are drug related, marijuana related, other hard drugs related, whether it's a deal or under the influence. Warrants are going back up again, and I think we're going to see that this is just to give you information. Some of this is post-pandemic related, jail space related, certainly. And then parole and probation. I think this is Kiki can talk to this better than I can. But these are just trends of numbers of who's on supervision, snapshots over time.
So ballot measure 110 for community justice, community corrections across the state has resulted in several things. One, first of all, the conditions of supervision changed. So people historically thought, well, somebody's on probation, they can't drink alcohol. That was what we used to have. But alcohol was only prohibited if that came from the court as a condition. Well, now we have no longer have a general condition that prohibits people from possessing drugs or using drugs. So it used to just be if you used methamphetamine when you were under supervision with us, that was a violation of your conditions. Now it has to be specifically ordered from the court. So we have a very large population of folks who do not have a specific condition prohibiting them from using drugs. That's a problem, right? Because we know that when we had that condition historically, we had the ability to provide service interrupt drug use, place them in custody if needed, and then refer them out to service. We don't have that ability now. So now we have folks reporting that are under the influence of intoxicants. You guys have told a story. I'll tell one from Friday. We had a person come in heavily using fentanyl, did not have a no intoxicants condition. The PO wasn't sure what to do, was pretty sure the person was going to overdose if they left, but we didn't have any options. We couldn't just make up, oh, you can't use drugs, because we don't have that condition. And so really our hands are tied, because now we can't interrupt that drug use. And so she was very concerned having that person leave our office, knowing that they were likely going to go out and use. They said they were going to go out and use, and she was concerned about, what can I do about this? Because there's nothing that we don't have any violation behavior presenting that we could do anything to interrupt that. Ballot measure 110, you can see that historically in Jackson County, we had a fairly high number of people under community supervision. Ballot measure 110 plus the pandemic has decreased that amount of folks under our care and supervision. We're funded from the state based on the number of people under our care and supervision. So this legislative session, 23-25, we're looking at a 12% reduction in our budget because we don't have that population. People can say, well, you don't have as many people under supervision, so you don't need those funds. Well, with those funds, we also create capacity at programs. And we don't have the ability to create capacity at programs now because our funding has been reduced. So maybe not 15 people needed the programming because they were only under supervision for drug crime, but maybe 10 of them also had a burglary attached where they're staying with us. We don't have the ability to continue those programs anymore because we don't have that capacity. With that funding decreases the number of programs that we're able to have people engage in. So we saw a budget reduction. Our population itself has gone down, and just overall, we cannot intervene in folks' lives where we historically have needed to intervene and provide that motivation, consequence for inappropriate behavior, and intervening in their lives to create opportunity for them to engage in services. So from community justice perspective, there's a couple of things, and I did want to, if I could, ask Joe to talk quickly about the impact on the juvenile side. I know you've heard this before, but I think it's important to continue to talk about the youth and what the difference is now with youth who possess alcohol and marijuana versus those that possess any other drug. So, Joe.
Sure. So if a youth gets cited for either alcohol or marijuana, and they come before the court can actually suspend their right to apply or their driver's license if they have one. If a youth is cited for fentanyl, meth, heroin, there is nothing. Juveniles no longer have fines and fees through the court system. That was taken away several years ago. And so really there is nothing other than an adjudication that they go through court. We've gotten to the point where we see hardly any of the e-violations. We've had 7 since 110 went into effect. We see very few MIPs of alcohol. We still see a considerable amount of marijuana, but that's dropped over the years too. And we see very few, a handful of either manufacture or possession of larger amounts of it. I think that goes with the age of the population now too. So I know it's frustrating to the law enforcement in terms of the work it takes to cite youth. And we're, that's what I hear a lot of is it's not worth the time of the e-violations. And so we're not seeing those, and definitely shows in the numbers as well. So.
Thank you. And Tanya, I think you could probably chime in this too. It has also taken away the opportunity for prevention and early intervention programs to try to get a little bit more upstream with these youth when they have their first incident of using substances. And we used to, just like you said, the opportunities for intervening in somebody's life to be able to help stop the pattern of and the intensity of their use has really changed. And in that meeting that I already referenced with Representative Nose and the group that was trying to improve ballot measure 110, there were many people around that table really voicing the concern around the lack of forethought about how this impacted youth in our communities. And so I'm going to get to that in a minute, but here is timely, right? This came out this week in the Atlantic magazine, well, last week, really talking about what has happened with Oregon being the only state in the country who has taken this attempt at decriminalizing drug use. I actually have hard copies of this article. If anyone is interested, they have them at this table. But it was very timely, and it does really talk about how it isn't what everybody thought it was going to be. So really, this is kind of directly from that the new laws enforcement provisions have proved ineffectual. Of 5,299 drug possession cases filed in Oregon Circuit Court since Measure 110 went into effect, 3,381 resulted in a recipient failing to pay the fine or appear in court and facing no other penalties, according to the Oregon Judicial Department. About 1,300 tickets were dismissed or are pending. The state audit found that during its first 15 months in operation, the treatment referral hotline received just 119 calls at a cost to the state of $7,000 per call. So, and then also a survey of law enforcement officers conducted by Portland State University found that as of July 2022, officers were issuing an average of just 300 drug possession tickets a month statewide, compared with 600 drug possession arrests a month before Measure 110 took effect, and close to 1,200 monthly arrests prior to the COVID outbreak. So this is really worth a read if people are interested. It really kind of goes into the details and really talks about how it's kind of an epic failure, and that there needs to be some fixing of it to really be able to get to what it was really promised to us to do in that first video that I showed you. So this was the attempt at House Bill 2513 to try to clean it up a little. This is Representative Nose's group. I'm very disappointed in what this actually came to be. I'm not sure that it really helped much, but it certainly did pile on some additional responsibilities for the county. So in this bill, it's asking that the local alcohol and drug planning committee, which Kiki's the co-chair of, becomes the group that manages the burn, right? That this is where we have the oversight, where they report to the community, all those kind of things. However, that's not really spelled out in statute in relation to what an LADPC does. And for our county, it's a little bit more complicated, which I won't really get into, but it's a rub. It's going to be a rub to have this burn group, this JCRN that we have locally, move over to a LADPC group to have them be doing the oversight and the committee and the coordination of all of those. And it says you can combine them. We probably wouldn't, because we have a standing LADPC and it is just Jackson County. It's supposed to provide opportunities for law enforcement officials regarding services that are available and to connect individuals to those services. I think that when I was at that meeting, I really made a big deal about how one of their biggest missteps was they didn't have conversations with law enforcement before this even started. And so when you don't bring people along with you and you don't let them weigh in on what they think would be helpful or not helpful, or what the impacts, unintended consequences to their systems might be, of course you're going to get people who aren't going to see the value in it. And so I do think that that's one of those pieces, that realizing that they did a misstep when they did not bring law enforcement into the conversation in the first place. And then also just looking at the efficacy of issuing citations as a method of connecting individuals to services. We know just from the numbers already that's not working. So we need to relook at that. And this House bill is supposed to be requiring OH to do that. Change the term of naloxone to short-acting opioid antagonist, so that in case something else comes out that's not naloxone, you could still use that as a safety method. I'm not going to go through all of these, but it is a lot of work to be done, and it's a lot of cleanup work, and it didn't really come with any money for the cleanup work. And they've already made the decision that all of the applicants from the first round will just be funded in full, without any questions asked or any reapplication necessary. So we have some consternation about that as well. Talks about a misdemeanor crime for possession of a Schedule II controlled substance for possession of more than 1 gram or 5 or more user units of a mixture of substance containing a detectable amount of fentanyl or derivative of fentanyl, which would potentially result in an increase of what community justice might.
Basically, you
do.
just align fentanyl with the other hard drugs.
Yeah.
But for the pill piece, like the 5 units. So, whereas, before you could have up to 5 grams of fentanyl and it was still an e-violation, but you can only have 2 grams of heroin or 3 of meth or whatever it was. Now it just aligns them in that same category as meth, essentially. So we can't arrest now for either over the 1 gram or 5 pills, I believe that's 5 pills. 5 pills, yeah. Where it used to be you could have 49 pills of fentanyl and it would usually fall underneath the 5 gram stuff.
Yeah. So again, this is a meager attempt of cleanup. It's going to take a lot of iterations, if not a repeal. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting, that upon the governor's signature, it became a declaration of an emergency, which I'm not really sure what that affords us in the long run, but that has been something that has been coming. This is
Okay,
you,
we
right?
won't belabor this. We've talked about all these other things, I think, to some degree already in this 1 o'clock. So if you have questions, though, or have comments, we can take those now and we can have copies of this. Yes.
I just have one quick question. So one of the other promises was it was going to reduce HIV, at least being bad in our communities.
That's always a harder one to measure because for like harm reduction, we would have to test every single person to know their status and then do a lot of studying. So, I mean, syringe exchange programs started in the late 80s, early 90s. We've seen what it can do. And so, yes, we know that works. But how Measure 110 then started to fund, because it's us, Max's Mission, and Stabbing Wagon really got funded for like that syringe exchange. I think what makes it hard is that each program is going to do something different and say something different. To where those things, I think, complicate it. And when you're talking about different standards, but naturally, yes, we know that syringe exchange programs do decrease and prevent the spread of HIV and Hep C.
But we were seeing that before 110, so 110 is what caused that. That's what you, like, it was one of the.
I don't know how we'll measure
Yeah.
it.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, so that's the other thing is now you had an pandemic that happened. We know from the pandemic with people not having access to services and testing that we're seeing those consequences with HIV specifically of seeing an increase there because they didn't have access to normal services and testing as they normally would. So the HIV one is a little bit more complicated. But when we talk about HIV, STIs, yes, one of those risk factors are people who do experience homelessness and then the illicit substances. That is one of those risk factors because they are having unprotected sex. So that's one of the ways HIV, unprotected sex and use of syringes are your two most ways that you see HIV spread.
But how we equate those two things, I don't know. Doug?
So back to the beds that Medford gets in the jail. I think it was 61 individuals, and my programs don't serve a high percentage of those, but it's made a difference for those folks, coordinating pretty carefully with the jail staff, with MPD and mental health staff to get different outcomes. Not always great success, but incremental successes sometimes.
The partners are huge to that. So all of our partners who engage in that you can't express how important it is to get those people engaged and the partners' willingness to step out and be a part of the process.
All right, we're over time. But thank you all. I'm sure this is not the last we will speak of this. And again, they have copies of that article if you're interested in it.